The rain came down in sheets that night, the kind of rain that makes the world feel smaller, heavier, like the sky itself is leaning on your shoulders. Inside the construction trailer, perched at the edge of the Beaumont River, 3 of the most decorated structural engineers in the state were screaming at each other over a set of blueprints that wouldn't stop curling at the corners from the humidity. The Beaumont Sky Bridge, a $400 million marvel of steel and concrete, was scheduled to open in 72 hours, and something was wrong, something nobody could name. The cables had been singing. That's the word the night shift kept using, singing, a low, mournful hum that vibrated through the deck plates whenever the wind picked up, a sound that made grown ironworkers cross themselves and look away. Marcus Webb, the lead engineer, slammed his palm against the table so hard the coffee cups jumped. "I'm telling you, the load calculations are perfect. I ran them myself 3 times. His face was the color of raw beef, veins pulsing at his temples, and his $1,000 shirt was stained dark under the arms. Across from him, Dr. Patricia Hollis pinched the bridge of her nose. "Then explain the harmonic readings, Marcus. Explain why the Eastern suspension cable is reading a frequency that shouldn't exist in any structure we've ever built." And then quietly, almost too quiet to hear over the rain hammering the metal roof, came a knock on the trailer door. 3 soft taps, then a pause, then one more. The engineers turned. Standing in the doorway, soaked through his Navy security uniform, holding a thermos of coffee in one hand and a clipboard in the other, was a 62-year-old black man named Elijah Carter. He'd been the night security guard on the Beaumont project for 18 months. He'd never spoken in a meeting. He'd never been invited to one. But that night, Elijah cleared his throat, took off his soaked cap, and said the words that would change everything. "Sirs, ma'am, I think I know what's wrong with your bridge. Man, listen, what happened in that trailer over the next 10 minutes? It's the kind of thing that doesn't make the news the way it should. The kind of story that gets buried under press releases and ribbon cuttings and corporate apologies that never quite get said out loud, but I'm gonna tell you, stay with me." Because before Elijah Carter walked into that trailer with rain dripping off his uniform, before he opened his mouth and dropped a truth that would humble 3 of the most powerful engineering minds in the country, you've got to understand who he was, where he came from, and why nobody, not one single person on that job site, ever thought to ask the man with the flashlight what he saw when the lights went down and the wind came up off the river. Because Elijah had been watching that bridge every night for 18 months, and what he had seen written down in a battered green notebook he carried in his back pocket was about to become the most important document on the entire Beaumont project. Elijah Carter grew up in a shotgun house outside of Mobile, Alabama, the youngest of 7 children in a neighborhood where the air always smelled like diesel and magnolia and the soft rot of the river when the tide went out. His father, Theodore Carter, had been a riveter on the shipyards during the war, and after the war, he'd worked construction, mostly bridges, mostly the dangerous high steel that nobody else wanted to touch. Theodore was a tall, quiet man with hands like cured leather and a voice that rarely rose above a murmur, but when he spoke, the whole household stopped to listen. He used to take Elijah down to the docks on Saturday mornings, just the 2 of them, and they'd sit on a wooden bench watching the cranes load freighters, and Theodore would point at things and explain them. He'd say, "Son, every structure tells you what it's gonna do before it does it. You just got to learn to listen. Steel groans before it gives. Concrete weeps before it cracks. Cables sing before they snap. And if you pay attention, Really pay attention. The building will warn you." Elijah was 8 years old the first time he heard those words, and he carried them in his chest for the next 54 years, like a folded letter from a man he'd loved more than anything. Theodore died when Elijah was 16, killed in an accident on a bridge in Pascagoula when a cable he'd warned the foreman about 3 different times finally let go and took him with it. The official report called it a freak occurrence. Elijah called it murder by indifference. He swore at his father's graveside that he would never, ever ignore a structure that was trying to tell him something was wrong. He went to community college on the GI Bill after a tour in the Army, studied civil engineering for 2.5 years, and then his mother got sick and the money ran out and he came home to take care of her. He worked construction for 30 years after that, mostly as a foreman, mostly on bridges, and along the way, he developed an ear and an eye that the certified engineers around him would have killed for, if they'd ever bothered to notice. But they never did. Because Elijah was a working man with calloused hands, and the world has a way of sliding right past men like that, especially when they look like Elijah looked. When his back finally gave out at 58, his doctor told him no more construction, so he took a security job. He told his wife, Loretta, it was just to keep busy. The truth was simpler. He missed the bridges. He missed the smell of welded steel and the sound of cables in the wind and the slow, deliberate rhythm of something enormous being built. Security work on a construction site let him stay close to the world he loved, even if he couldn't touch it anymore. And the Beaumont Sky Bridge, when the contract came through, was the biggest, most ambitious bridge project the state had ever seen. Elijah took the job before they even finished offering it. The Beaumont project was the brainchild of a man named Garrison Whitfield III, the CEO of Whitfield Engineering Group, a fourth-generation aristocrat who wore custom Italian suits and had a smile that never reached his eyes. Garrison was 47 years old, 6'2", with prematurely silver hair he kept slicked back like a senator running for re-election, and he had a particular habit of clicking the back of his fountain pen against his teeth when he was thinking, a small ticking metronome that everyone on his staff had learned to dread. He'd inherited the company from his father, who had inherited it from his father, and Garrison had spent his entire adult life proving he deserved it, mostly by spending money loudly and demanding that the world admire his vision. The Beaumont Bridge was supposed to be his legacy, his monument. The cable-stayed structure stretched 2,400 feet across the Beaumont River, with twin diamond-shaped pylons rising 480 feet into the air, and when the lights came on at night, it looked like a harp made of starlight, a thing so beautiful it almost hurt to look at. Garrison liked to bring potential investors to the construction site at sunset, walk them out onto the unfinished deck, and let them feel small. He had a script he used. He'd say, "This isn't just a bridge. This is the future. This is what happens when American engineering refuses to compromise." And the investors would write checks, and Garrison would smile his cold smile. And somewhere in the shadows, beyond the construction lights, Elijah Carter would be making his rounds, listening. Because from the very first week he'd worked the site, Elijah had heard something he didn't like. It was small at first, a hum in the eastern anchor block when the temperature dropped below 45 degrees, a faint creak from the third cable up on the south pylon when the wind came in from the Gulf. Things that would have been invisible to anyone who didn't already know what bridges sounded like when they were healthy. Elijah knew. And he started writing things down. Small entries in a green spiral notebook, dated and timed with weather conditions and exact locations. November 14th, 2:17 a.m., temp 41 degrees, wind east-southeast at 12, Audible harmonic vibration cable EC7, duration approximately 90 seconds. December 2nd, 4:03 a.m., temp 38. Audible groaning Eastern anchor, accompanied by visible microflexing of the deck joint at expansion gap 42. He filled pages. He filled the back of the notebook. He filled the margins. And he tried. Oh, he tried to tell someone. 3 times in the first 6 months on the job, Elijah Carter walked up to a project manager during the day shift and tried to share what he'd been observing. The first time, he approached a man named Derek Sloan, the assistant project director, in the parking lot outside the main office. Derek was 34, a Princeton graduate, and he was holding a sandwich in one hand and his phone in the other when Elijah said, "Excuse me, sir. I work nights here, and I've noticed something with the cables I think you should know about." Derek looked at him the way you look at a man asking for spare change. He smiled a tight, tolerant smile and said, "That's great, buddy, but we have a whole engineering team for that. You just keep an eye on the gates, all right?" And he walked away before Elijah could even open the notebook. The second time, 2 months later, Elijah caught Marcus Webb himself in the hallway of the trailer complex and tried to hand him a written summary of his observations. 2 single-space typed pages he'd worked on for 3 nights at his kitchen table while Loretta watched her shows in the next room. Marcus took the pages, glanced at them for less than 3 seconds, and laughed. Not a cruel laugh. Worse, a pitying one. He said, "Look, Mr. Carter, is it? I appreciate the enthusiasm. I really do. But this is a multi-$100 million project, and we have computational fluid dynamics modeling that accounts for every variable you can imagine. The cables hum sometimes. That's normal. It's wind across cylindrical structures. It's called aeolian vibration, and it's been studied to death since the 1800s. He folded the pages, handed them back, and patted Elijah on the shoulder like a man returning a child's drawing. The third time, Elijah didn't even get to speak. He walked into the trailer one morning at the end of his shift to ask for 10 minutes with anyone who would listen, and Garrison Whitfield himself was standing there, holding court in front of a group of contractors. Garrison looked up, saw Elijah in his security uniform, and said in front of every man in the room, "Can someone explain to the night guard that this is an engineering meeting? Don't we have a break room for staff?" The contractors laughed. One of them said, "How'd he even get in here?" And Elijah, 62 years old with his father's voice in his head telling him to keep his temper and remember who he was, simply nodded once, turned around, and walked back out into the rising sun. He didn't write in his notebook for 3 days after that. He couldn't. The notebook felt heavy in his pocket, like it was full of something that didn't matter. And for the first time in his life, he wondered if his father had been wrong. If maybe the world really didn't want to listen to Bridges, didn't want to listen to men like him, didn't want to listen at all. But on the 4th day, Loretta found him sitting on the back porch at 5 a.m. staring at his coffee. She sat down next to him, put her hand on his, and said, "Eli, honey, your daddy didn't teach you to listen so you could quit when nobody else heard you. He taught you to listen so you'd be ready when the time came." And Elijah Carter, who hadn't cried since his mother's funeral, put his face in his hands and wept. And then he picked up the green notebook and he started writing again. By the time the calendar rolled over to the week of the Bridges grand opening, Elijah had filled 463 pages of observations, cross-referenced with weather data he pulled from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration's website at the public library, and he had identified what he believed was a catastrophic resonance flaw in the eastern suspension array. A flaw that would, under specific wind and temperature conditions, cause the entire bridge to enter a destructive feedback loop. He had drawings, he had calculations, he had timestamps. He had everything except a single person willing to look at it. And then the cable started singing in a way they had never sung before. It started on a Tuesday night, 6 days before the scheduled grand opening. Elijah was on his rounds at 1:47 a.m., walking the eastern approach with his flashlight beam swinging in slow arcs across the wet concrete when he heard it. The sound was different, lower, sustained, a note that didn't fade. He stopped walking, he held his breath, he turned off his flashlight so his other senses could work harder. And what he heard made the hair on the back of his neck stand up like he was 12 years old again, standing on a dock with his father, learning that steel could talk. The eastern suspension cables were vibrating in unison, not the chaotic, scattered hum of normal aeolian flutter. A coordinated, harmonic, deepening tone, and underneath it, like a heartbeat, the slow groan of the anchor block, taking strain it was never designed to take. Elijah pulled out his notebook with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. He wrote down the time. He wrote down the temperature. He wrote down the wind direction, and he wrote, in capital letters across the bottom of the page, 3 words: "It is happening." He went back to the security shack and he made a decision. He picked up his radio and he called the night supervisor, a young man named Kevin who was kind to him and who, at least, didn't talk to him like he was furniture. Kevin came down 20 minutes later, listened to the cable for himself, and his face went pale. He'd been in bridge sites before. He knew what wrong sounded like. Kevin said, "Elijah, what do you want to do?" And Elijah said, "I want you to tell whoever is in charge that I need 10 minutes in the engineering trailer tomorrow night. And I'm not asking." The next night was the night of the rainstorm, the night the engineers were screaming over the curling blueprints, the night Marcus Webb's coffee cup jumped on the table, the night Dr. Patricia Hollis pinched the bridge of her nose and asked Marcus to explain the harmonic readings that shouldn't exist. Kevin had done what Elijah asked. He had gone quietly to Doctor Hollis at the end of the day shift and told her that the night security guard, a man named Carter, had observations she might want to hear. Patricia Hollis was the only one of the 3 lead engineers who had not yet made up her mind about anything, and something in Kevin's voice, some thread of fear, made her say, "Bring him by tonight." So when Elijah knocked on the trailer door at 10:43 p.m., dripping wet, holding his thermos and his clipboard, he was, for the first time in 18 months, expected. Marcus Webb was not happy about it. The moment Elijah stepped into the trailer, Marcus rolled his eyes so hard his whole head moved. He said, "Oh, you've got to be kidding me, Patricia." Garrison Whitfield, who had driven down from his hotel suite in the city specifically because of the cable readings, was sitting in the corner with his fountain pen tapping against his teeth, and he looked at Elijah with the tired, performative patience of a man being asked to deal with a stray cat that had wandered into his dinner party. He said, "Sir, I'm sure you mean well, but we are in the middle of a critical engineering review. Could you wait outside?" And Patricia Hollis, who had been watching Elijah's face, watching the way his eyes had immediately gone to the harmonic readings on the screen behind her, watching the way his hand had tightened on the clipboard the second he saw the Eastern Cable graph, said, "No." She said it quietly, but she said it firmly. She said, "Mr. Carter, please, come in, sit down, tell us what you've seen." The trailer went silent except for the rain. Elijah walked to the table. He set down his thermos. He opened his clipboard, which was just a cover for the green spiral notebook, and he began to speak. He didn't speak the way Marcus Webb spoke, with technical jargon and dismissive certainty. He didn't speak the way Garrison Whitfield spoke, with sweeping vision and rehearsed cadence. He spoke the way his father had spoken on that wooden bench by the docks 54 years ago, slow and clear, the words arriving exactly when they were needed, and not a second sooner. He said, on November 14th at 2:17 in the morning, when the temperature dropped to 41 degrees and the wind came in east-southeast at 12 miles per hour, cable EC7 began to vibrate at what I believe is a frequency near 3.8 hertz. He flipped a page. He said, on December 2nd, when the temperature fell to 38 and the wind shifted, the eastern anchor block began producing a low register groan that lasted 3 minutes and 40 seconds. And during that time, the deck joint at expansion gap 42 visibly flexed beyond what the design tolerance should allow. He flipped another page and another. He read them his observations for 45 minutes, page after page, dated and timed, and slowly, the trailer began to change. Marcus Webb stopped rolling his eyes. He started taking notes. Dr. Hollis pulled up the original design specs on her laptop and began cross-referencing every claim Elijah made with the engineering data, and her face grew paler with every match. Garrison Whitfield's pen stopped tapping. When Elijah finished, he closed the notebook. He looked up. He said, I believe the Eastern Suspension Array has a resonance vulnerability under specific atmospheric conditions, and I believe those conditions are forecast to occur during the opening ceremony in 3 days. I believe that if you put 400 dignitaries and a marching band on that deck on Saturday morning, the bridge is going to enter a destructive harmonic feedback loop, and people are going to die. And then he picked up his thermos, and he took a long, slow drink of his coffee. Marcus Webb was the first to speak. His voice came out hoarse. He said, "Can I see those numbers again?" Patricia Hollis was already typing furiously. She said, "Oh my God! Marcus, look at this. Look at the modal analysis. We never accounted for the mass damper coupling at sub-5 hertz with the new cable diameter. We assumed the original spec. The two engineers fell into a frantic technical conversation, scrolling through models, pulling up simulations, their voices getting faster and tighter, and the words coming out of their mouths were the words of two people watching a disaster they had almost authored. In real time, becoming visible. Garrison Whitfield was still sitting in the corner. He hadn't moved. His face had gone the color of cold ash. He said, in a voice that tried to be calm and failed, "This is absurd. We are not going to delay the opening because a security guard with a notebook claims he hears something. We have permits. We have press. We have the governor flying in." Patricia Hollis turned slowly in her chair and looked at him. She said, "Garrison, he's right. The math is right. We have to close the bridge." Garrison stood up. He said, "No, we don't. We run a few extra simulations, we add a few damper retrofits, we get through the ceremony, and we address it next quarter. This is a public relations issue, not a structural one." Marcus Webb, of all people, was the one who turned on him. Marcus, whose ego had been the loudest thing in every room he'd ever entered, stood up too, and he said, "Garrison, if we open that bridge on Saturday, we are going to murder people. I'm not doing it." Garrison's face went from ash to red. He said, "You'll do what I tell you to do, or you'll never work in this industry again." And Elijah Carter, who had been quiet through all of it, took out his phone. He said, "Sir, I have been recording this conversation with permission from the night supervisor and Dr. Hollis, who I notified before I arrived. I've also already this afternoon sent copies of my observation logs and my analysis to the State Department of Transportation, the Federal Highway Administration, and a reporter at the Beaumont Tribune. I didn't do that because I wanted to hurt anyone. I did it because 3 different times over the past 18 months I tried to tell people what I was seeing, and 3 different times I was treated like I didn't matter. So this time I made sure I mattered. The trailer was completely silent. Garrison Whitfield sat back down, slowly, like a man whose legs had stopped working. Patricia Hollis put her hand over her mouth. Marcus Webb closed his eyes. And outside, the rain kept coming down, and the cables kept singing, and somewhere across the dark river, the eastern anchor block groaned again, low and patient, waiting. The emergency closure announcement went out at 6 a.m. the next morning. The grand opening was postponed indefinitely. The story broke in the Beaumont Tribune by noon, and by the following Monday, it was on every national news network in the country. The headline that ran above the fold said it plain. Night Guard saves bridge, top engineers couldn't. The state opened a formal investigation. The Federal Highway Administration sent a team. Independent structural analysts confirmed every observation in Elijah Carter's green notebook, and the final report concluded that if the bridge had opened on schedule, with the planned ceremonial load and the forecast wind conditions on Saturday morning, the eastern suspension array would have entered a resonant collapse cascade within the first 90 seconds of the dignitaries walking onto the deck. Estimated casualties, the report said, would have exceeded 300. The hearing was held 6 weeks later in the state capitol, in a chamber with marble columns and brass railings and the kind of acoustics that made every cough sound like a gunshot. Garrison Whitfield was called to testify under oath. He arrived in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than Elijah's car, and he sat at the long oak table with his lawyers on either side of him, and his fountain pen was, for once, completely still on the table in front of him. The committee chairwoman, a stern woman named Senator Rivera, asked him to explain, in his own words, why a man who had identified a catastrophic flaw in his bridge had been dismissed 3 separate times by his staff, and once personally by Garrison himself in front of a room full of contractors. Garrison cleared his throat. He started to give a prepared statement about systemic communication failures and process improvements, and Senator Rivera cut him off. She said, "Mr. Whitfield, I didn't ask for a press release. I asked you a question. Why did you not listen to him?" Garrison opened his mouth. He closed it. He opened it again, and he could not, in front of cameras and senators and the entire nation, find a single answer that didn't sound like exactly what it was. So he said nothing, and his silence rang through that marble chamber louder than any words he could have spoken. Elijah Carter was called to testify next. He walked to the table in a brown suit Loretta had pressed for him that morning, and he sat down and he placed his green notebook in front of him, and he was sworn in. Senator Rivera asked him, "Mr. Carter, can you tell us how you knew?" And Elijah was quiet for a moment. He looked at the notebook. He looked at his hands. He looked up at the senator. He said, "Ma'am, my father was a bridge man. He died on a bridge in Pascagoula in 1977 when a cable he had warned his foreman about 3 different times finally broke. The official report called it an accident. I was 16 years old and I stood at his graveside and I promised him that I would never, ever ignore a structure that was trying to tell me something was wrong. Whatever else I am, ma'am, I am his son." And I was listening. The chamber was silent. A few of the senators had to look away. Senator Rivera, after a long moment, said, "Thank you, Mr. Carter." And the cameras kept rolling, and across the country, in living rooms, in break rooms, and on phones held in trembling hands, people watched a 62-year-old black security guard in a brown suit sitting next to a battered green notebook become the most important voice in American engineering for the entire month of October. Whitfield Engineering Group lost its federal contracts within 90 days. Garrison Whitfield was forced to resign as CEO and was later indicted on 3 counts of criminal negligence and 1 count of attempted intimidation of a witness. He took a plea deal. He served 18 months in a federal facility. His name was quietly removed from the company his great-grandfather had founded. Marcus Webb resigned voluntarily and spent the next 2 years working on a public engineering ethics curriculum, which is now taught in 12 major universities. Doctor. Patricia Hollis was the one who personally drove out to Elijah's house 2 days after the hearing with a thank you card she'd written by hand and a job offer from a structural integrity firm in Atlanta that wanted to bring Elijah on as a senior field consultant, no degree required, full benefits, a salary 3 times what he had ever earned in his life. Elijah read the offer at his kitchen table with Loretta standing behind him with her hand on his shoulder, and he smiled, the small, slow smile he had learned from his father. He said, "Ma'am, I appreciate this, I really do, but I think I'd like to keep the security job, if that's all right." They listened now. He took the consulting work part-time. The Beaumont Sky Bridge was redesigned. The retrofit took 8 additional months and cost $47 million, but when it opened, on a clear morning in June, with a marching band on the deck and the governor cutting the ribbon, the eastern suspension array hummed in the wind like a perfectly tuned instrument. And there was a small bronze plaque mounted at the base of the eastern pylon that read, "This bridge stands because someone listened." Beneath those words was a single name, Elijah Theodore Carter. He walked his rounds that night, after the ceremony, after the crowds had gone home and the lights had dimmed and the river had returned to its black and patient self. He stopped at the eastern anchor. He turned off his flashlight. He held his breath. He listened. The cables sang, soft and clean and right. He took out his green notebook. He wrote one last entry. He wrote, "Daddy." They listened. He closed the notebook and he walked on. So that's the story. That's what happened. And listen, I know we live in a world that's quick to look past men like Elijah Carter, quick to assume the man with the flashlight doesn't have anything to say, that the woman behind the counter doesn't have anything to teach us, that the old guy on the bench couldn't possibly know more than the kid with the diploma. But I'm telling you right now, every single time we make that assumption, we are walking onto a bridge somebody tried to warn us about. Every time. So if this story moved you tonight, if it made you think about the people you might have brushed past, the voices you might have missed, do me one favor. Hit that like button. Share this with somebody who needs to hear it. And drop a comment below telling me about the Elijah Carter in your own life, the one nobody listened to until it was almost too late. Because the truth is, there are bridges all around us, and they are all, every single one of them, trying to tell us something. The only question is whether we'll be the kind of people who listen. Stay safe out there, and I'll see you on the next one.